This is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Zotac Gaming 4080 16GB AMP Extreme AIRO GPU. And in this video, I'm going to set it up and also test and give you some benchmarks on it, talk about the experience with it, and show you it compared to my 3090. So I've temporarily upgraded because this is a review unit which I have to return, but I put it through its paces in various different ways, both video editing, rendering, obviously playing games, and also working on it. And you'll see some benchmarks in a little while and talk about that. But also, obviously, out of the box, a chunky beast of a graphics card, really huge and potentially very powerful. And it also has a number of other highlights and things of interest. So you might be aware already that this comes with an adapter which requires 3 power cables that you can see there. And I'll talk a bit more about that later on. It also has an anti-sag bracket included in the box, which is going to be pretty important because this is not only chunky, but it's also a heavy graphics card. It has RGB lighting accents on it, and obviously some very nicely designed cooling things. I'll talk a bit more about that as well, because I found it a little bit loud, and your experience may vary, obviously. But here you can see close-up look of the GPU. Now I'm going to test this in various different ways. I'm actually using my 49-inch Ultrawide, which is a 5120 by 1440p, 240Hz monitor to benchmark this. So a bit unusual for what most people will be testing with standard 1440p or 4K. It's a little bit larger, and I found it quite punishing on a number of different GPUs, but more on that later on. So in the box, you obviously get this power adapter cable, which requires 3 power supply cables. You also have a little RGB connection, which you can connect up from the GPU, and a number of other highlights. You've seen that there's an anti-sag bracket, for example, and I think that's going to be pretty important because you will see that it does actually is already sagging in my case, and that's partly down to the weight. There are instructions in here on how to set it up and how to connect things up. And I will say that I think this light strip installation bit will be quite fiddly to do, but it does work without plugging in that cable. You just connect it up to your PC and it'll automatically recognize it. And obviously then the sag bracket can be installed as well. I unfortunately couldn't use it because I have fans below that, but that's going to vary from case to case. Now, obviously, large, people will want to know the size. So here you can see just how big it is and how long it's going to be. And I'm also going to be installing it in a Lian Li Dynamic Evo case to give you an idea of the fit there. It does take up a little bit more room than my 3090, but not a massive amount more. So that's a bonus if you're moving from one reasonably large GPU to another. So this is my Gigabyte 3090 side by side. You can see that the 4080 is quite a bit bigger, chunkier and fatter. So obviously it takes up more slots than the original GPU, potentially a lot more than older generations as well. So something to bear in mind. And it isn't quite as nice looking. I really wish more manufacturers did white cards. I really like my Gigabyte card for this, really snazzy, and it obviously goes with my white build as well, as you'll see in a minute. Now, the other thing that I was struck by when I got those two out and compared them in the hand was just the weight difference. And I think this will matter over time as the sag is obviously going to potentially be a problem, but you can see how much the 3090 weighed there, and then by comparison, this is nearly 2 kilograms, so a pretty hefty beast. And that's obviously down to a large cooling fins to keep it running cool, those heat pipes that you can see, and all the fans as well. There's a lot of active cooling in here, and that's part of the point of it. It's called the Aero card because it was an air optimized design, so they're claiming, which means that it's got a good airflow and should run cool. And actually, as you'll see, I did find it actually does run cool in most instances, even under a quite heavy load. So I haven't had any problems there. But again, that's going to vary from case to case. So it's worth keeping that in mind. One of the things to bear in mind is the setup of the new power connector. So you now only have a single power connector, and you need that adapter that's included in the box. So this is a single 600 watt connector, and that requires 3 power connections that you can see here on one end, and then it plugs in there. Now, it's worth noting that this GPU is a review sample, which means it's been seen by other people, and it looks like it's been used and abused by whoever had it before me because one of the cables is already fraying. You might have seen there are several videos on this and the 4090 on how some of these cables are a bit dodgy, and you need to be careful when installing them to make sure that you don't bend them in any direction, side to side especially, but also up and down. So when you're installing, you have to be careful that you don't install these too tight and too taut. You also need to make sure that they're pushed in firmly so that they're well connected up, because the other problem people have is that they have installed it in a way that where it's not quite seated properly, which has then led to some issues with potentially catching fire. So just bear that in mind. That's mostly been with 4090s though, but the biggest problem apparently, according to Gamers Nexus, is people aren't seating these in properly. So if you are going to use this cable, you need to make sure it plugs all the way in. And once you've done that, you then need 3 PCIe connectors to go up to it, so 8-pin connections. Now the recommendation is, if possible, to use the single connectors. So you can see we've got a 1 8-pin PCIe connector here that plugs in. That is a cable that then goes off to the PSU and then plugs in there. Now you often find that most power supply units don't have those single connectors, or at least not multiples of them. Usually you have these ones which are sort of split into 2 and daisy chained together. It is possible to use these, you can. The recommendation for the best performance is to use the single ones wherever possible. But if you try and do that with all of these, you're going to end up with quite a bit of a mess, as you'll see, because I'm basically demonstrating that now. So I've got one that's got a straight connector on it, one that's got the 2 on it, and then another one that we're going to throw in there as well. So you can see quite a bit messy. It's going to be difficult to maintain sort of a neat setup in terms of the wiring in your case. And this is a big concern. And this is probably why people have had problems, because they've tried to manipulate that and handle it. But there's good news, because there is a solution. So I'm using a Corsair PSU, which I've done a video on separately that I'll link to in the description. And you can also purchase a cable specifically for this series of graphics cards, which is designed to basically deal with this problem. So it has the 600 watt connection on one end, and then just 2 connectors that go into your power supply unit on the other end. This makes life a lot easier because it's just one single connection, but more importantly, it looks a lot neater. You can see that you basically have one long cable that you can then run to the back of your case. So instead of using that adapter, which is already frayed, I've now got this better cable which I can run off to the back, and it looks a bit neater. It's not the snazziest looking cable, but it's cable tied in various places and it shouldn't have any issues. Also, it's designed specifically for Corsair power supplies, so perfect fit in there, and it basically just connects up at the other end at the PCIe connections on that. So again, if you want to find out more about that, I'll link in the description to the power supply itself and to the build video on this case so you can find out more. But basically here you can see you just plug in the 2 ends into the PCIe connectors on there and then run it through to the front of your case and connect up the GPU. Excuse the mess at the rear of my case. There is a reason for that. I regularly have to swap things out, so I don't bother cable tidying because it would be a nightmare. But here you can see the finished product. And you will notice, if you watched earlier on when I was taking out my 3090, sort of the size difference, this does jut out a little bit further, but you can see there's still quite a bit of room towards the front of the case. And obviously I also have a number of fans blowing on it. Now, one other point of note is I do have a M2 expander card below the GPU, which could potentially block some of the airflow, but there's still good airflow into the case. And as you'll see, I still end up getting good temperatures out of it as well. So once again, be careful not to manipulate the cable in a way that you're pulling it in any direction. You need to try and keep it straight and make sure it's loose fitting so it's not too taut. It doesn't look that great, but I think this Corsair cable adds to the aesthetic where the adapter probably wouldn't. So this is the end product, obviously set up and installed. You can see it has some RGB lighting around it in multiple different angles. Obviously you can adjust this, but I've found that as standard and default, it goes quite nicely with the aesthetic of my case anyway. I actually like to run my fans on blue most of the time. Obviously this is on the first boot with the sort of rainbow on those Lian Li fans, but eventually we'll get into some blue vibes in a minute. Now, it is a bit of a chunky monster, but it is worth it, I think. Based on my experience with it, I've actually found it pretty good. Now, I did note earlier on, I have noticed there is some extra noise from it. So whether it's coil whine or the different fans, there's definitely a noise which is perceptibly louder than previous. And than my 3090 definitely. And obviously this might just be my individual test unit. It is a review sample, so it has been through a ringer with various different people. So there's every chance that it's just an issue with this particular card rather than overall. However, I have found that I can hear the sound, and even through the active noise cancelling headphones that I'm wearing, sometimes it's quite nagging. So it's worth keeping in mind that potentially you've got a noise. You will notice, obviously, I've got a lot of fans in the case. So the fact that you can hear the card, even with the glass on and those fans running, it's noticeably different. But now I've got it set up and I'm running in Windows. You can see we're idling at around 30 degrees C. And then I wanted to start off by doing some video editing. So one of the things I did was, before I installed the card, I ran a test where basically I'd edited a video and it was ready to go. I rendered it with my 3090 because I wanted to see how long it would take. And then I went through that same process and I basically rendered the exact same video again with exactly the same settings using the 4080. And the difference is actually really good. I basically shed about a minute or two. So you can see the original was about 10 minutes, 47 seconds. And then with the 4090, it was 9 minutes and 9 seconds. So a couple of minutes of knocked off my render, which doesn't sound like much. When you add it up over multiple different videos being rendered, is actually pretty useful. Obviously, it also means that I can scrub through the timeline really easily without any problems, although I haven't had any issues with my 3090, and Resolve has been pretty solid. I highly recommend DaVinci Resolve if you're going to be doing video editing. It's the best software that I've tested and used, and a good smooth experience from both of these. Then I went into some gaming sessions, and I started off with Red Dead Redemption 2, and that's because I know from experience that this game is really punishing on my monitor. So as I said earlier, this is a Samsung Odyssey G9. This is a 49-inch Super Ultrawide. It runs at 5120 by 1440p, and so it has a really big pixel density and also 240 hertz refresh rate total, HDR and other things. I've done videos separately on this, but the point is, like, historically, so the first time I had this monitor, I was running it on a 2080 Ti, and it was really not very good in terms of FPS. It was getting something like 30 or something FPS on ultra settings. Now I'm getting an average of 99 according to the benchmark. Minimum is 27 though, so even on ultra settings on this game is still being pretty punishing. As you can see, nice and smooth for the most part, and really good visuals out of it as well. So it's done a good job here. I think we've moved on quite away from the 2080 and now have a much smoother experience. So what I've tried to do with all these benchmarks is basically run the games on maximum settings. You do have the option on a number of more modern games to have DLSS settings turned on, which will obviously make a difference to the FPS as well, but I've tried to avoid it, or I've done a bit of both so you can get some. But here you can see with that turned on maximum settings and running there, we've got 65 degrees on the GPU, which isn't terribly hot, I don't think. Obviously, this is going to vary from case to case, but with my fan set up, you can see what we were getting out of it there, so pretty good. And without unnecessarily ramping up all the fans as well, basically all set to the quiet mode. So this is hardly like running on extreme, but it goes to show that the cooling on the GPU is pretty effective. So next up is Ready or Not. This is a tactical first-person police shooter, which you can play with your friends in co-op, which is pretty nice. And again, I was running this on maximum settings to get the most glorious views out of it. And I found I was topping out somewhere around 200 FPS. It does vary from level to level. Not perfectly optimized this game because it's still early access, but what I did find is nice high FPS. Obviously, we're making the most of the 240 hertz refresh rate there, but this is also a glorious looking game on this monitor, as you can see from various different shots here. And so maxed out 200 FPS and averaged around 180-ish. So pretty decent performance again, and nice views from that. And then Modern Warfare 2, so I like a bit of the single player on this, and some of these scenes are pretty intense. And I ended up running it at about 130 FPS to 160. And then I was setting the DLSS mode onto the quality settings, sort of maximize the FPS. So at the top end is basically 160 FPS with maximum settings, but DLSS set to quality mode to obviously sort of still give the good visuals while also improving the FPS on it as well. And again, nice and smooth, good action out of it as you'd expect, and pretty good experience. Next up is Cyberpunk 2077, which traditionally has been a very punishing game on all the GPUs I've tested to try and max it out, especially at this resolution. It really ends up just not running very well, and that's still the case even all this time after the original launch. So I tried running it both with DLSS on and off, because DLSS makes quite a bit of a difference in this. And so the initial benchmarks were maximum settings, essentially, with all the ray tracing on to make the most of the visuals, because it is a really stunning game, and without DLSS on. And I found essentially I was getting about 30 FPS with the benchmark, which is not great. Relatively smooth, but you know, still not perfect, not what you'd want usually as a PC gamer, especially when you've paid out this much money for a GPU. But you can see it's averaging 33 FPS, minimum 27. So obviously DLSS is pretty important here. So I put DLSS on, again with quality mode, and ran the benchmark again, and I was getting around 61 FPS. And I was playing it as well, so I was playing some of the levels and found a similar experience. I then ran through Forza Horizon 5, and this is on the extreme settings with DLSS turned off, and I found I was getting about 129 FPS there, and with DLSS on, it actually made a marginal difference, only getting about 136. But I mean, you know, there's nothing to sniff at there. That's pretty decent performance at this resolution and with the best graphics, because it is visually really pleasing as well. So again, pretty good results there, I'd say. Into Battlefield, which you saw a little bit earlier of, and here obviously massive amount of things going on, 128 player servers and just utter chaos constantly, so good FPS is pretty important. But I found, again, maxing out the settings on it, 120 FPS roughly as well. The other thing that I wanted to do was to test and see how I'd get on with a variety of things. So obviously I stream on a Friday and Saturday, game with my mates. If you don't know already, I've got a gameplay channel where I do all that, so head over there, Provoked Prawn Pews, and give me a subscribe if you haven't already. But what I wanted to do here is all the usual things that I do. So I usually stream and record clips while I'm doing it with my 3090 without any problems. Here what I was doing was streaming and recording clips, but also recording entire sessions. So basically recording two things at once and playing the games and streaming. And still my performance was really good. Still I was getting that high FPS count, really smooth experience, and the clips have come out really well. And it's all been great. And this is proof that you can do loads of different things with this GPU. So I'll leave all the specs of my system in the description, and obviously links to find out more about the graphics card. But hopefully you found this useful and interesting. Let me know in the comments what you think. Thanks for watching.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.